She was supposed to be someone, once. Lena Rae Harlow was valedictorian, piano prodigy, preacher's daughter, but a cruel twist of fate, an abusive relationship, and the shame of a small town's whispering tongues left her 8 months pregnant, penniless, and sleeping in the mud behind a stranger's barn. She had nothing left but the quiet defiance in her eyes and a baby coming too soon. Until Weston Cade, the wealthy and emotionally armored heir to the sprawling Cade Ranch Empire, rode in on the tail end of a storm. What he saw in that moment wasn't pity. It was fire, it was fate. With a voice that made the earth pause, he said, "Get up, girl, you're mine now." But this town doesn't forget, and love doesn't grow clean in the mud. Together, they'll face a trial of ghosts, secrets, and the terrifying power of a second chance. What happens when the richest cowboy in town discovers the girl in the dirt holds the key to healing his own broken heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Copper Creek Valley like an old man's memories. Soft, persistent, and tinged with the golden light of things that used to be. The Cade Ranch stretched across 40,000 acres of Montana's most coveted land, where the Rockies kissed the sky and cattle grazed on grass so green it looked painted by the Lord's own hand. This was big sky country, where a man's word still meant something, and the horizon promised both freedom and consequence in equal measure. Weston Cade stood on the wraparound porch of the main house, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he watched the sun climb over the eastern ridge. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd learned early that power was best wielded with restraint. His dark hair showed touches of silver at the temples, and lines around his gray eyes spoke of too many seasons, squinting into hard weather and harder truths. The house behind him was a testament to 4 generations of Cade ambition, a sprawling log and stone structure that had grown with each patriarch's success. His great-grandfather had built the original cabin with nothing but determination and calloused hands. His grandfather had added the east wing after striking oil on the back 40. His father had commissioned the grand staircase and expanded the stables to house 50 horses. Now it was Weston's turn to leave his mark, though he'd spent the last decade wondering what legacy was worth building when you had no one to pass it to. The ranch employed 67 people year-round, and during calving season, that number swelled to over 100. Each morning brought the familiar symphony of boots on gravel, truck engines turning over in the pre-dawn darkness, and the low murmur of men discussing the day's work over thermoses of coffee and biscuits wrapped in foil. It was a rhythm Weston had known since childhood, as reliable as the sunrise and as comforting as his mother's voice calling him in for supper. But comfort, he'd learned, was a luxury a man could afford, until life reminded him how quickly everything could change. The kitchen door creaked open behind him, and Martha Brennan stepped onto the porch with the careful movements of a woman who'd seen 73 winters, but wasn't ready to admit defeat to any of them. She'd been the Cade family's housekeeper for 35 years, arriving fresh from County Cork with nothing but a fierce work ethic and a tongue sharp enough to keep 3 generations of Cade men in line. "You're brooding again," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside him. Her Irish accent had softened over the decades, but still colored her words like watercolors on wet paper. "And that coffee's stone cold, I can tell from here." Weston smiled despite himself. Martha had an uncanny ability to read his moods from across a room. "Just thinking about the Henderson place." "Ah." Martha rocked slowly, her keen blue eyes surveying the valley below. The old Henderson spread. "Been empty, 3 years now? 4 this Christmas." Weston's jaw tightened. The Henderson Ranch had been their closest neighbor for 60 years, a modest operation run by decent people who'd worked the land with love and respect. When drought and falling cattle prices had finally broken them, Weston had offered to buy the property for twice its market value. Tom Henderson had looked him in the eye and said he'd rather let the bank take it than see his life's work swallowed. Up by the Cade Empire, pride, Weston knew, was both a man's greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. The property had sat empty ever since, the house slowly surrendering to weather and time while the pastures grew wild. Local teenagers had discovered the abandoned barns made excellent places for drinking beer and practicing the kind of foolishness that seemed essential to growing up in a small town. Sheriff Hawkins made regular patrols, but short of posting a guard, there wasn't much anyone could do to keep kids from being kids. Mrs. Patterson mentioned she saw smoke coming from the old place yesterday evening, Martha said, her tone carefully neutral. Thought you should know. Weston nodded, already reaching for his truck keys. Smoke could mean anything from teenagers, with a campfire to vagrant transients seeking shelter. Either way, it was his responsibility now. The bank had finally agreed to sell him the Henderson place 2 months ago, though the paperwork wouldn't be finalized until the new year. In the meantime, he felt obligated to keep an eye on the property, if only out of respect for Tom Henderson's memory. The drive to the Henderson place took 20 minutes along back roads that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows, where wildflowers painted the landscape in shades of purple and gold. Weston drove slowly, partly because the gravel road demanded caution and partly because he wasn't eager to confront whatever he might find. The last thing he needed was to spend his Saturday morning dealing with hungover teenagers, or worse, some desperate soul who'd taken shelter in a place that held too many memories already. The Henderson house came into view as he crested the final hill, a modest 2-story farmhouse with green shutters and a front porch that had once welcomed neighbors for Sunday dinners and barn raisings. Now the shutters hung crooked, the porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and weeds grew tall enough to hide the foundation. It was a sight that never failed to twist something deep in Weston's chest. A reminder of how quickly the things we build can crumble when we're not there to tend them. He parked near the main gate and sat for a moment, studying the property with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read the land like scripture. The barn behind the house showed signs of recent activity. A section of the big door stood slightly ajar, and the weeds around the entrance had been trampled down. No smoke was visible now, but the faint scent of wood ash hung in the morning air. Weston climbed out of his truck and walked slowly toward the barn, his boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been maintained in years. The familiar weight of his Colt .45 pressed against his hip, not because he expected trouble, but because a man who owned 40,000 acres of Montana ranch land learned early that preparation and paranoia often looked identical from a distance. The barn's interior was a cavern of shadows and dust motes, dancing in shafts of sunlight that slipped through gaps in the weathered siding. The smell hit him first, the lingering scent of horses and hay overlaid with something more recent and human. Someone had been living here, and recently, a makeshift camp occupied the far corner of the barn, hidden behind a wall of stacked hay, bales that had been there since Tom Henderson's last harvest. Weston approached quietly, his senses alert for any sign of movement or danger. What he found made him stop in his tracks and question everything he thought he knew about mercy and providence. A young woman lay curled on a bed of horse blankets and old feed sacks, her body turned toward the wall in the universal posture of someone trying to make themselves invisible. She was clearly pregnant, very pregnant, and even in sleep, her face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Her dark hair was matted with mud and straw, her clothes torn and stained. Beyond recognition, but it was her hands that caught his attention and held it. Despite everything, the dirt, the desperation, the obvious hardship, her fingers were long and elegant, the hands of someone who'd once known gentler work. A thin silver chain around her neck disappeared beneath her torn sweater, and Weston, caught the glint of what looked like a locket nestled against her throat. She stirred as his shadow fell across her makeshift bed, and when her eyes opened, Weston felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with pity or charity. Her eyes were the color of deep water, blue-green and fierce despite her circumstances. There was intelligence there and pride, and a kind of defiant strength that reminded him of wild horses he'd seen in the high country, beautiful, untamed, and determined to survive no matter what the world threw at them. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Weston could see her calculating, fight or flight, trust or terror. He kept his hands visible and his voice gentle when he finally spoke. "Easy now," he said, the same tone he used with spooked cattle. "I'm not here to hurt you." She struggled to sit up, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other reaching for something behind the hay bales. Weston caught a glimpse of what looked like a kitchen knife, its blade catching the morning light. "Stay back," she whispered, and her voice carried the educated cadence of someone who'd known better days. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'll be. You're gone by tonight, I promise." Weston raised his hands slowly, showing her his palms. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if even that simple question carried too much risk. "Does it matter?" "Everything matters," he said quietly, "especially when it comes to a woman in your condition sleeping rough in an abandoned barn." Something in his tone must have reached her because the knife lowered slightly. "Lena," she said finally, "Lena Harlow." The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd heard it whispered in church pews and coffee shops, passed along with the kind of righteous judgment that small towns wore like Sunday clothes. Reverend Samuel Harlow's daughter, the preacher's prodigy, who'd fallen so far from grace that her own father had turned his back on her. "Lena Rae Harlow," he said, and watched her flinch at the use of her full name. "Tom Henderson used to speak highly of your piano playing, said you could make those keys weep." Her eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. That was a long time ago. Not so long that it's forgotten. Weston took a careful step closer. "When's the baby due?" "Soon." Her hand moved protectively over her belly. "Any day now, I think." The thought of this woman giving birth alone in a cold barn made something fierce and protective rise in Weston's chest. He'd failed to protect his sister Emma when it mattered most. He wouldn't fail again. "Get up, girl," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made grown men follow him into business deals and cattle drives. "You're mine now." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down before God and witnesses. Lena's eyes widened, and for a moment, Weston thought she might bolt like a startled deer. Instead, she lifted her chin with a pride that spoke of breeding and backbone, even as her circumstances screamed otherwise. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not anymore." Weston studied her face, reading the story written there in sleepless nights and hard choices. This wasn't some flighty girl who'd gotten herself into trouble through carelessness. This was a woman who'd been beaten down by life but refused to stay down, even when staying down might have been safer. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But that baby you're carrying deserves better than a cold barn and whatever scraps you can find. And so do you." Lena's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You don't know anything about what I deserve. I know you're sleeping in mud when you should be in a warm bed. I know you're 8 months pregnant and alone when you should have people looking after you." Weston took another step closer, his voice gentling. "I know your daddy's got half the town believing you're some kind of fallen woman, but I also know Tom Henderson, and he didn't speak kindly of fools or sinners." That broke something in her composure. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, carving clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "Tom Henderson was a good man," she whispered. "Better than most in this town." He was, and he saw something worth respecting in you, even when others didn't. Weston crouched down to her level, careful not to crowd her. "Let me help you, please." Lena clutched something close to her chest. A yellow baby blanket, hand-knitted and worn soft with handling. It was the only thing in this makeshift camp that looked clean and cared for, and Weston realized it represented everything she had left to give her child. "Help costs," she said. "I learned that lesson already. What do you want in return?" The question hit him harder than it should have. In her world, kindness came with strings attached, and protection had a price that women, like her, always ended up paying. The thought of what she might have endured to survive this long made his hands clench into fists. "Nothing you're not willing to give," he said firmly. "My word on that." She searched his face for the lie, the trap, the hidden agenda. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and began the careful process of standing. Weston moved to help her, offering his arm for support, and felt the fine tremor running through her body. Exhaustion, fear, and the physical strain of carrying a child while living rough. "My truck's outside," he said. "I'm taking you to my place. You can get cleaned up, have a proper meal, see a doctor." "I can't pay for a doctor." The words came out fierce with shame. "Did I ask you to?" That stopped her short. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for someone like me?" "Someone like what? A woman in need? A neighbor's daughter?" Weston shook his head. "Lady, I don't know what story folks have been telling about you, but all I see is someone who could use a helping hand." As they made their way slowly toward the barn entrance, Lena's steps became increasingly unsteady. She stopped suddenly, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other gripping Weston's arm with surprising strength. "Wait!" she gasped. "Something's—" "Oh." A warm wetness spread down her legs, soaking through her torn jeans and puddling on the barn floor. Her eyes went wide with panic and realization. "The baby," she whispered. "It's coming." Weston felt his own surge of panic, quickly suppressed by years of handling crisis situations. A ranch foreman learned early that panic was a luxury no one could afford when lives hung in the balance. "How long have you been having pains?" he asked, already calculating. "Distances to the nearest hospital. Off and on for days, but they weren't—" "This is different." Another contraction hit her, and she doubled over with a cry she tried to muffle. "We need to get you to a hospital, now." Weston scooped her up in his arms, ignoring her weak protest. She weighed less than she should have, all belly and bones, and the realization of how little she'd been eating made his jaw clench. The drive to Copper Creek General took 45 minutes on a good day. In Lena's condition, with contractions coming faster and harder, it felt like a journey to the edge of the world. Weston drove with one hand on the wheel and one eye on his passenger, who gripped the door handle and breathed through each wave of pain with the kind of determination that spoke to something deep in his soul. "Tell me about the baby's father," he said, partly to keep her focused and partly because he needed to know what they might be dealing with. Lena's face went white. He won't be a problem." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "His name's Trevor Mullins. He's from Billings, works construction when he's not drinking or—" She trailed off, touching her ribs in a gesture that told its own story. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question, among other things. Lena's laugh held no humor. "He said he loved me, said we'd get married, said all the things girls like me want to hear. Turned out love looked different to him than it did to me. Where is he now?" "I don't know. I left while he was passed out drunk, took my car and what little money I had, and drove until the car died. That was 3 weeks ago." She looked out the window at the passing landscape. "Been walking ever since." Weston did the math in his head. 3 weeks on foot, 8 months pregnant, with no money and nowhere to go. The fact that she'd survived at all spoke to a strength that most people never had to discover in themselves. "Does your family know where you are?" The question hit like a physical blow. Lena's whole body seemed to collapse in on itself. "My father made it clear I was no longer welcome in his house or his church. Said I'd brought shame on the family name, and he wouldn't have me corrupting the other young women with my choices." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 12. Cancer." Lena's voice went flat. Daddy never remarried. Said he had the church. And me, and that was family enough. I guess I proved him wrong about that too. They were pulling into the hospital parking lot when the next contraction hit, stronger than the rest. Lena cried out, doubling over as far as her seatbelt would allow, and Weston saw something that made his blood freeze. Blood. Too much blood. He was out of the truck and around to her side before the contraction passed, lifting her out with careful urgency. "Stay with me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You're going to be fine. The baby's going to be fine." But as he carried her through the automatic doors of the emergency room, calling for help in a voice that brooked no argument, Weston found himself making the kind of promise a man had no business making. Whatever it took, however long it lasted, he would protect this woman and her child. The alternative, losing someone else he'd chosen to care about, was simply not acceptable. The last thing he saw before the medical team swept Lena away was her hand clutching that yellow baby blanket, like a lifeline, and the silver locket at her throat catching the harsh hospital lights. Whatever secrets that locket held, whatever dreams it represented, Weston swore he'd help her reclaim them all. The waiting room at Copper Creek General smelled of disinfectant and nervous prayers. Weston sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair that had seen too many vigils, his hat balanced on his knee and his eyes fixed on the double doors that had swallowed Lena 3 hours ago. The emergency room had erupted into controlled chaos when he'd carried her through those doors, nurses appearing from nowhere, a gurney materializing as if summoned, and Dr. Sarah Chen taking charge with the kind of calm efficiency that came from 20 years of delivering babies in rural Montana. False alarm, Dr. Chen had explained after what felt like an eternity. Braxton Hicks contractions, made worse by dehydration and exhaustion. The bleeding was from a small tear that's already healing, but she needs bed rest, proper nutrition, and someone keeping an eye on her. That someone, Weston had realized with crystalline clarity, was going to be him. Now Lena lay in a hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped reassurance about her. Baby's heartbeat, while Weston wrestled with the magnitude of what he'd taken on. Bringing home a pregnant stranger was the kind of decision that would set tongues wagging from here to Billings, but he'd made harder choices with less cause. The sound of sensible shoes on linoleum announced Martha's arrival before she rounded the corner, carrying a thermos of coffee and the kind of expression that meant she had things to say and intended to say them. At 73, Martha Brennan had earned the right to speak her mind, and she'd never been one to waste that privilege. "So," she said, settling into the chair beside him with a grunt that acknowledged her arthritis without surrendering to it. "Mrs. Patterson called. Said half the town saw you racing toward the hospital with a very pregnant young woman in your truck." Weston accepted the coffee she offered, inhaling the familiar comfort of Martha's brew, strong enough to float a horseshoe and laced with just enough Irish cream to smooth the edges. News travels fast. Faster when it involves a Cade and a Harlow. Martha's blue eyes, still sharp as winter morning, studied his face. "You know who she is, then?" "I know she's in trouble and needed help." Weston met her gaze steadily. "Rest of it's just gossip." Martha was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her own cup of coffee. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand its cruel mathematics. "I knew her mother, you know, Grace Harlow. Sweet girl, played piano at church until the cancer took her voice first, then the rest. That little girl, Lena, she was maybe 12 when Grace passed. Watched her mother waste away and then had to be strong for a father who didn't know how to be anything but a preacher. She mentioned her mother died young. Broke Samuel's heart. Losing Grace did. Man threw himself into the church work like it could fill the hole she left behind. Maybe it did for him. But that little girl," Martha shook her head. "She raised herself mostly. Cooked and cleaned and played piano for services because it was what her mother would have wanted. Smart as a whip, too. Valedictorian, full scholarship to the university. What happened? Martha's expression darkened. Same thing that happens to too many bright girls who never learned they had choices. Met a boy who talked pretty and made promises he never intended to keep. By the time she figured out what he really was, she was carrying his baby, and her father was calling her a disappointment to the family name. The pieces were starting to fit together in Weston's mind, forming a picture of a young woman who'd done everything right until one wrong choice unraveled her entire life. The father, Trevor Mullins, you know him? Know of him. Construction worker, drifter, the kind of man who thinks his fists make him strong and his words make him smart. Martha's mouth tightened. Heard he's been asking around town looking for her, making threats about what he'll do when he finds her. A cold anger settled in Weston's chest. Let him try. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Martha patted his knee with the fond exasperation of someone who'd been mothering Cade men for 3 decades. But bringing her home won't be without complications. Folk'll talk, and some of it won't be kind. Folk have been talking about the Cades for 4 generations. Haven't killed us yet. No, but this is different. This is about a woman's reputation, and that's a fragile thing in a small town. Martha's voice gentled. You sure you know what you're taking on? Before Weston could answer, Dr. Chen appeared through the double doors, pulling off latex gloves and looking like someone who'd wrestled with difficult decisions and won. Sarah Chen had delivered half the babies in Copper Creek County over the past 2 decades, including 3 generations of ranch hands' children. She was small, efficient, and possessed of the kind of bedside manner that balanced honesty with hope. She's stable, Dr. Chen said without preamble. Baby's fine heartbeat, strong, but she's severely malnourished and dehydrated. I'd guess she's been living on scraps for weeks, maybe longer. Another few days like that, and we could have lost them both. The words hit Weston like a physical blow. How bad is it? Bad enough that I want to keep her overnight for observation. After that, she needs proper care. Regular meals, prenatal vitamins, bed rest. The baby's due in about 3 weeks, and we need her as strong as possible for delivery. Dr. Chen studied his face. I assume she'll be staying with you? Yes. The word came out without hesitation, surprising no one more than Weston himself. Good. She'll need someone watching for signs of premature labor, and given her condition, I'd rather have her close to people who care about her welfare. Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. She's been through hell, Weston. Whatever story brought her to that barn, it wasn't her choice to be there. Can I see her? She's asking for you, actually. Room 214. But keep it short. She needs rest. More than anything else right now. Room 214 was small and sterile, dominated by the hospital bed where Lena lay propped against pillows that made her look even smaller and more fragile than she had in the barn. Someone had cleaned the mud from her hair and face, revealing delicate features and skin that would have been beautiful if not for the hollows of hunger and exhaustion. The silver locket still hung around her neck, catching the afternoon light that streamed through the window. She turned when he entered, and something in her expression made him stop just inside the door. It wasn't gratitude, though that was there, but something deeper and more complicated. Fear, maybe, or the kind of desperate hope that came from having nothing left to lose. The doctor says you're going to be fine, he said, settling into the visitor's chair beside her bed. She also says I need somewhere safe to recover. Lena's voice was hoarse from the IV fluids they'd given her, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in the barn. I can't go back to sleeping rough, not with the baby coming so soon. You won't have to. Your offer still stands? Even knowing what people will say about you taking in someone like me. Weston leaned forward, his grey eyes meeting hers with steady certainty. Lady, I've been the subject of small-town gossip since I was old enough to tie my own boots. I reckon I can handle a little more. For the first time since he'd found her, Lena smiled. It was a small, tentative thing, but it transformed her face completely. In that moment, Weston caught a glimpse of who she'd been before life had beaten her down. The preacher's daughter who'd played piano like an angel and dreamed of bigger things than Copper Creek could offer. Thank you, she whispered, and the words carried the weight of prayers answered and second chances granted. Outside the hospital window, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising rain that the drought-stricken valley desperately needed. Weston took it as a good sign. Sometimes the best things came after the worst storms, and he had a feeling this woman and her baby were going to bring more changes to his life than he could possibly imagine. The guest wing of the Cade house hadn't seen use in nearly 5 years, not since Weston's aunt had visited for his father's funeral. Martha had spent the morning airing out the rooms and changing linens that smelled of lavender sachets and good intentions. By the time Weston brought Lena home from the hospital, the space felt warm and welcoming, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Lena stood in the doorway of what would be her room, one hand resting on her swollen belly and the other clutching a small paper bag that contained her few possessions: the yellow baby blanket, a change of clothes donated by the hospital charity box, and whatever she'd managed to save during her 3 weeks on the road. Her silver locket caught the afternoon light streaming through windows that looked out over the valley where she'd once lived, in a preacher's house, and dreamed of playing piano at Carnegie Hall. "It's too much," she said quietly, though her eyes lingered on the comfortable bed and the writing desk positioned near the window. "I can't possibly—" "You can and you will," Martha interrupted, appearing with fresh towels and the kind of no-nonsense expression that had cowed 3 generations of Cade men. "The doctor's orders are bed rest and proper nutrition can't accomplish either sleeping in a barn." Lena's laugh was shaky. "I haven't slept in a real bed in months. I might have forgotten how, like riding a bicycle," Martha said briskly, though. Her eyes were kind. "Your body remembers comfort even when your mind's forgotten what it feels like to be safe." Safe. The word hung in the air like a prayer Lena wasn't sure she deserved to have answered. She'd spent so long running, hiding, surviving day by day that the concept of safety had become as foreign as the idea of trusting anyone with her welfare. "There's a bathroom through that door," Weston said, his voice carefully neutral. "Martha stocked it with everything you might need. Dinner's at 6, but if you need anything before then, just holler." He turned to leave, but Lena's voice stopped him. "Why are you doing this?" It was the same question she'd asked in the barn, but now it carried different weight. Now she'd seen his home, met his people, understood the magnitude of what he was. Offering. This wasn't charity, this was sanctuary, and it came without conditions or expectations that made her skin crawl with remembered fear. Weston paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the hallway light. When he turned back, his grey eyes held depth she was only beginning to understand. "I had a sister once," he said quietly. "Emma. She was younger than me by 8 years, full of fire and music, just like you probably were at her age. Got herself into trouble with a boy who promised her the world and delivered nothing but heartache." Lena's breath caught. Past tense. Had a sister. She was too proud to come home, too scared to stay. "By the time I found her," Weston's jaw tightened. "Well, some mistakes you only get to make once. Some failures you carry forever. The weight of old grief colored his words, and Lena understood with sudden clarity that she wasn't the first lost soul Weston Cade had tried to save. The difference was, this time he'd found her before it was too late. "I'm not your sister," she said gently. "No. But you're someone's daughter, and that baby you're carrying is someone's future. Seems to me that's reason enough." After he left, Lena stood alone in the room that was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with Trevor in Billings. Through the window, she could see ranch hands moving cattle across pastures that stretched to the horizon. And beyond, the mountains where her troubles had begun, with a construction job and a smooth-talking man who'd made promises in the dark. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Martha appeared with a steaming mug of tea and a plate of sandwiches cut into triangles, the kind of simple kindness that had become extinct in Lena's world. "Chamomile?" Martha said, setting the tray on the nightstand. "Good for settling both nerves and stomachs. And those sandwiches aren't a suggestion. You're eating for two, and from the looks of you, you've been doing a poor job of it." Lena accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "I don't know how to repay this kindness." "Start by not running off in the middle of the night." Martha's blue eyes were sharp with understanding. "I've seen that look before, child. The look of someone who's spent so long expecting the worst that they can't recognize genuine help when it's offered. How do you know I won't bring trouble to this house?" Martha settled into the chair beside the bed, with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested, but whose spirit remained unbowed. "Because Weston Cade's the best judge of character I've ever known, and because trouble has a way of finding good people regardless. Better to face it with allies than alone." She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a worn leather folder, the kind used to store important documents. "Besides, your father left this at the church office 3 months ago. Asked Pastor Mills to give it to you if you ever came back." Lena's hands trembled as she accepted the folder. Inside were copies of her birth certificate, high school diploma, and college transcripts, the paper trail of a life she'd thought was lost forever. But tucked between the official documents was something that made her breath catch, a church bulletin from the Sunday after she'd left home. In the margin, written in her father's careful script, were the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." "He's been preaching about lost sheep for 3 months, Martha said quietly, "about the 99 left in the wilderness. While the shepherd searches for the one that's gone astray, man's been waiting for his lost lamb to come home." Tears Lena had been holding back for months finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks as she clutched the bulletin to her chest. All this time, she'd believed her father had written her off completely, that his disappointment had turned to indifference. But this suggested something different. This suggested hope. "Does he know where I am?" "Not yet, but he will soon enough. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves a Cade taking in a Harlow." Martha's expression softened. "The question is, what do you want him to know?" Before Lena could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching the house interrupted the quiet afternoon. Through the window, she could see several trucks pulling up the circular drive, ranch hands returning from their work, probably, or neighbors, coming to welcome her home. But something in Martha's sudden stillness suggested otherwise. The older woman moved to the window, her body language shifting from maternal comfort to protective alertness. "Well," Martha said, her voice carefully neutral, "looks like word's gotten out faster than expected." Lena joined her at the window and felt her blood turn to ice. The lead truck was familiar, a battered Ford with a dented tailgate and Arizona plates. She'd ridden in that truck across 3 states, fleeing a life that had become unbearable, only to discover that geography couldn't cure heartbreak or erase mistakes. Trevor Mullins had found her. "Martha," she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to protect her belly, "I need to leave right now." But Martha Brennan had not spent 35 years managing Cade men without learning something about standing ground when it mattered most. She reached into her other apron pocket and withdrew a set of rosary beads worn smooth by decades of worried prayers. "Child," she said firmly, "you're not running anymore. Not while there's breath in my body and fight left in these old bones." Outside, truck doors slammed with the finality of decisions made and consequences accepted. Lena's past had caught up with her future, and there was nowhere left to run. Trevor Mullins hadn't changed much in the 3 weeks since Lena had fled their apartment in Billings. He still carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him something, still wore his work boots like weapons, and his smile like a blade. What was different was the desperation underneath, the kind that came from losing something you considered your property and finding it in someone else's possession. Weston met him at the front porch, flanked by 2 ranch hands who'd appeared, as if summoned by some unspoken signal. Diego Santos, the ranch foreman, was a compact man in his 50s who'd learned to read trouble in 3 languages. Beside him stood Billy McKenna, barely 21, but built like the college linebacker. He'd been before choosing ranch work over a business degree. "Help you with something?" Weston's voice carried the deceptive calm of deep water, peaceful on the surface, dangerous in the depths. Trevor spat into the gravel, a gesture calculated to show disrespect. "Name's Trevor Mullins. I'm looking for my woman." "Heard you might be harboring her. Your woman." Weston's tone didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "That's an interesting way to put it. Lena Harlow. She's carrying my baby and she belongs with me." Trevor took a step closer, close enough for Weston to smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "I know she's here. Saw her at the hospital yesterday. Heard the whole story about how you played hero." Diego's hand moved casually to rest on the hammer hanging from his tool belt. Billy stepped slightly to the left, creating angles that would make retreat difficult for anyone foolish enough to try. These were men who'd worked together long enough to communicate without words, and they'd seen enough of life to recognize predators when they came calling. "Miss Harlow is a guest in my home," Weston said quietly. "She's under my protection, and she'll remain so as long as she chooses." Trevor's laugh was ugly. "Protection? That's what you're calling it? Stealing another man's woman and his unborn child?" His voice rose, carrying across the ranch yard where other workers had stopped their tasks to watch. "I got rights, Cade. Legal rights to that baby. Rights you'll discuss with a lawyer if you're so inclined. What you won't do is come onto my property making demands and threats." Weston's grey eyes had gone cold as winter stone. "I suggest you turn around and leave. Now." "I'm not leaving without what's mine." The words hung in the air like a challenge. In the guest wing window, Lena watched the confrontation unfold with a sick feeling in her stomach that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She'd seen Trevor like this before, drunk on anger and entitlement, convinced that volume and aggression could substitute for being right. Martha stood beside her, rosary beads clicking softly as her weathered fingers worked through decades-old prayers. "That man's got the devil in him," she murmured. "I can see it from here." "He wasn't always like this," Lena said, though the words felt hollow. "When we first met, he was charming, funny. He made me feel special, like I was the only woman in the world who mattered to him. Men like that always start charming. It's how they get their hooks in." Martha's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of the world to understand its patterns. "Question is, what changed him?" Lena touched her belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, as if responding to the tension outside. "I think he was always this way. I just couldn't see it until it was too late." Below, the confrontation was escalating. Trevor had taken another step toward the porch, and Weston had moved to meet him. The 2 men were roughly the same height, but there was a fundamental difference in how they carried themselves. Trevor's aggression was loud and showy, designed to intimidate. Weston's was quiet and controlled, the kind that came from absolute confidence in his ability to handle whatever came next. "You think you're better than me because you got money?" Trevor's voice cracked with frustration. "Think you can just take what you want because you own some land and cattle?" "I think I'm better than you because I don't hit women," Weston replied, and his words carried across the yard like a judgment pronounced. "Because I don't get drunk and use my fists to solve problems my brain can't handle. Because when I give my word to protect someone, I keep it." The accusation hit Trevor like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists that had left their mark on Lena's ribs and arms during the dark months when she'd convinced herself that love was supposed to hurt. "You don't know anything about me and her," Trevor snarled. "She came to me willing enough, spread her legs easy as breathing when I sweet-talked her right." The crude words were designed to provoke, and they succeeded. Weston's expression went arctic, and Diego Santos cursed softly in Spanish, while Billy McKenna took a step forward. Violence hung in the air like heat lightning, promising storms ahead. But it was Martha who diffused the moment. Appearing on the porch, like an avenging angel in sensible shoes and a floral apron. In her hands, she carried a double-barreled shotgun that had belonged to Weston's grandfather, and she held it with the comfortable familiarity of someone who knew which end the danger came out of. "Young man," she said in the tone she'd used, "to scold 3 generations of Cade boys, you're standing on private property, using language that would make a sailor blush. You have 30 seconds to get back in that truck and drive away before I introduce you to my friend Bertha here." Trevor stared at the elderly woman holding a shotgun, like other women held knitting needles, and for a moment the absurdity of the situation seemed to penetrate his alcohol-fueled rage. "You wouldn't dare." Martha's smile was sweetness itself. "Son, I've been keeping unwanted varmints off this ranch for 35 years. You'd be surprised what I'd dare." "This isn't over," Trevor said, backing toward his truck while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "Lena's mine and that baby's mine. I got rights, and I'll be back with papers to prove it. Next time, bring a lawyer," Weston called after. "Him, and maybe some manners." As Trevor's truck disappeared down the drive in a cloud of dust and gravel, Lena felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the sensation of being truly protected. Not controlled, not possessed, but safeguarded by people who expected nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. Martha returned to the guest room. The shotgun once again retired to whatever closet had held it, and found Lena sitting on the bed with tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's all right, child," Martha said, settling beside her with the gentle efficiency of someone who'd comforted many fears over the years. "He's gone, and he won't be back today, but he will be." "Back," Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "He always comes back. That's what men like Trevor do. They take what they want, and they don't let go until something forces them to." Martha was quiet for a moment, her blue eyes thoughtful. Then she reached into the drawer of the nightstand and withdrew something that made Lena's breath catch. A small wooden music box, painted with delicate flowers and worn smooth by gentle handling. "This belonged to Emma," Martha said softly, "Weston's sister. She loved music almost as much as she loved getting into trouble. Weston gave it to her for her 16th birthday, right before everything went wrong." The music box played a simple melody when opened, "Beautiful Dreamer," rendered in the tinkling notes that only childhood treasures could produce. It was the same song Lena had played at her mother's funeral, the last piece of music she'd performed before grief made her. Fingers forget their way around the keys. "Why are you showing me this?" Lena asked. "Because that young man downstairs has been carrying guilt about failing his sister for more than 10 years. Because he sees something in you that reminds him of her, the strength, the music, the stubborn refusal to give up even when the world's determined to grind you down." Martha's voice gentled. "And because sometimes the best way to heal old wounds is to prevent new ones." As if summoned by their conversation, Weston appeared in the doorway, his expression still dark with controlled anger, but his eyes gentle when they found Lena's face. "He's gone," he said simply, "and he won't set foot on this property again without consequences. He'll be back with lawyers, with papers, with some legal claim to force me to go with him." Lena's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she closed the music box. "You don't know him like I do. He doesn't give up on things he considers his." Weston studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of promises made in churches and courtrooms. "Then we'll be ready for him, all of us, together." Outside, storm clouds continued to build over the mountains, and the first drops of much-needed rain began to fall on the drought-stricken valley. Inside the Cade house, 3 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of different kinds of storms began to plan for a future that none of them could have imagined just days before. The confrontation with Trevor had rippled through copper, Greek-like stones thrown into still water, each circle of gossip wider and more distorted than the last. By evening, half the town knew that Weston Cade had taken in the preacher's fallen daughter, and the other half had opinions about what that meant for everyone involved. Sheriff Jake Hawkins arrived just as the ranch hands were finishing their evening chores, his patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled into the circular drive. Jake was a good man, fair, honest, and possessed of the kind of common sense that came from 20 years of keeping peace in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. He'd also been Weston's friend since childhood, which meant this: visit would be both official and personal. "Heard you had some excitement today," Jake said, settling into one of the porch rockers with the careful movements of a man whose back protested long days in a patrol car. His uniform was crisp despite the late hour, but his expression carried the weight of complicated problems that had no easy solutions. Weston handed him a beer from the cooler. Martha kept stocked for exactly these kinds of conversations. Trevor. "Mullins came calling, made some demands about Lena and the baby. I declined to accommodate him." "Figured as much. He stopped by the office afterward, drunk as a lord and twice as belligerent. Wanted to file kidnapping charges against you. Claims you're holding his woman against her will." Jake took a long pull from his beer. "I explained to him that women aren't property and that Miss Harlow is free to stay wherever she chooses." "How'd he take that news?" "About as well as you'd expect from a man who thinks the law exists to enforce his personal grievances." Jake's expression darkened. "He's not giving up, Weston. Got himself a lawyer from Billings, some bottom feeder who specializes in custody disputes and harassment cases. They're filing papers tomorrow." Weston felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had 10 years ago when Emma had called from Denver, crying and scared and too proud to ask for help directly. He'd failed her then, letting pride and anger cloud his judgment, until it was too late. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. What kind of papers? A paternity suit, for starters. If he can prove the baby's his, he'll have legal standing to demand visitation rights, maybe even shared custody. And there's something else. He's claiming common law marriage. Says they lived together long enough in Montana to establish spousal rights. The words hit like a physical blow. Weston had spent enough time around lawyers to understand the implications. If Trevor could establish legal claim to either Lena or the baby, he could use the courts to force contact, to maintain control even from a distance. Is that possible? The common law thing. In Montana, if they lived together and presented themselves as married, maybe. Depends on the specifics. Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he used for delivering bad news. "There's more. He's also claiming you interfered with his parental rights by kidnapping Lena. Says he's got witnesses who will testify about your obsession with her." Obsession. The word tasted bitter in Weston's mouth. His word, not mine. But Weston, you need to understand. This could get complicated fast. Small-town politics, big city lawyers, and a pregnant woman caught in the middle. It's the kind of mess that ruins reputations and destroys lives. Before Weston could respond, the sound of another vehicle approaching interrupted their conversation. This time it was a silver Mercedes that looked out of place among the ranch trucks and utility vehicles. The woman who stepped out was equally polished, blonde, beautiful, and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to wonder where her next meal was coming from. Caroline Morrison. Weston's ex-fiancé, successful attorney, and the last person he wanted to see in the middle of an already complicated situation. "Well," Jake said quietly, "looks like this evening just got more interesting." Caroline approached the porch with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. She'd always been beautiful, but 5 years of city living had added a sophistication that made her seem foreign in the ranch setting where she'd once felt at home. Her business suit was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless, and her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Hello, Weston," she said, her voice carrying the polished neutrality of someone who'd learned to hide emotion behind professionalism. "Sheriff Hawkins, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Caroline. Weston stood, years of ingrained politeness overriding his desire to avoid this conversation. "What brings you back to Copper Creek?" "Business, actually. I'm representing Mr. Trevor Mullins in a custody matter. I believe you're acquainted with the case." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Of all the lawyers in Montana, Trevor had somehow managed to retain the one person guaranteed to complicate Weston's life beyond measure. Whether by design or coincidence, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Jake whistled softly. "Well, that's just perfect." Caroline's smile didn't waver. "I've filed papers in family court requesting immediate custody evaluation and temporary restraining orders. Mr. Mullins has legitimate concerns about the welfare of his unborn child and the circumstances of Miss Harlow's current living situation." "Circumstances?" Weston's voice went dangerously quiet. "An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man, accepting financial support and shelter. Some might view that as compromising to her moral standing and fitness as a mother." Caroline's tone remained professionally neutral, but her eyes held depths of old hurt and current satisfaction. "The court will want to ensure the child's best interests are protected." "You mean Trevor's interests are protected?" "I mean my client's legitimate parental rights are recognized and enforced." Caroline stepped closer, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped to reveal something more personal underneath. "You always were too quick to play hero, Weston. Always ready to save someone without thinking about the consequences." The accusation stung because it carried truth. He had tried to save Caroline once from a family situation that demanded more emotional availability than he'd been capable of giving. When she'd needed him to choose between the ranch and their relationship, he'd chosen the land and the legacy, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but at least I'd try." Caroline's composure cracked slightly. "And look how well that worked out for Emma." The words hung in the air like a curse pronounced. Jake shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the kind of pain that time couldn't heal and words couldn't take back. Emma's death had destroyed more than just Weston's family. It had ended his engagement to Caroline and driven a wedge between them that 5 years and hundreds of miles hadn't been able to bridge. "That's enough," Jake said firmly, standing and placing himself between them. "Caroline, you've delivered your message. Weston, you need to call your own lawyer tomorrow morning. This conversation is over." As Caroline walked back to her Mercedes, Weston felt the weight of old failures settling on his shoulders like winter snow. Emma's voice echoed in his memory. Young and scared and asking for help he'd been too stubborn to give. Now another young woman needed protecting, and the same forces that had destroyed his sister were aligning against Lena. In the guest wing, a window, a light burned as Lena sat by the writing desk, her hands moving across paper in the careful script she'd learned from her mother. She was writing letters to her father, to the few friends who might still remember her kindly, to anyone who might be willing to speak for her character when the time came. On the desk beside her lay a photograph she'd found in the dresser drawer. Weston and Caroline on their engagement day, both of them young and hopeful, and certain their love could overcome any obstacle. The ring on Caroline's finger caught the camera's flash like a promise of forever, but the photo had been tucked away in a drawer with other memories too painful to display. Lena traced the edges of the frame with gentle fingers, understanding instinctively that she'd walked into the middle of a story that had been unfolding long before her arrival. Weston Cade was a man haunted by failures he couldn't undo and choices he couldn't remake. Caroline Morrison was a woman who'd loved him and lost him to forces beyond her control, and now all three of them were caught in Trevor Mullins' web of legal manipulation and emotional terrorism, with an innocent baby's future hanging in the balance. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley as the storm that had been building all day finally broke over the mountains. Rain lashed against the windows like tears the sky could no longer hold back, and somewhere in the distance, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary clarity. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and court papers and the kind of fight that destroyed reputations and shattered lives. But tonight, In the safety of the Cade house, 3 wounded souls prepared for a battle none of them had chosen, but all of them were determined to win. The courthouse in Copper Creek had seen its share of human drama over the past century, but seldom had the gallery been packed with such a volatile mix of community members, all drawn by the spectacle of a custody battle that had divided the town along lines of class, morality, and simple human decency. Judge Eleanor Hartwell, a woman of 74, who'd been dispensing justice with equal measures of wisdom and tartness for 3 decades, surveyed the crowd with the expression of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human foolishness. Caroline. Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table beside Trevor Mullins, who'd managed to clean himself up enough to pass for respectable in an ill-fitting suit that couldn't quite hide the aggression simmering beneath the surface. Across the aisle, Weston's attorney, Marcus Reynolds from Helena, a man whose reputation for protecting ranch families was legendary, arranged his papers with methodical precision. Lena sat behind the defense table, her hands folded over her, swollen belly and her face pale but determined. The past week had been a whirlwind of depositions, medical examinations, and character witnesses, all building toward this moment when a judge would decide whether Trevor Mullins had any legal claim to the child she carried. "Your Honor," Caroline began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd never lost a case she truly wanted to win. "My client seeks nothing more than recognition of his fundamental rights as a father. Mr. Mullins and Miss Harlow lived together as husband and wife for 6 months. He supported her, provided for her, and planned for their child's future together." Judge Hartwell's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held the sharpness of someone who'd heard every sob story and manipulation tactic in the book. "Continue." "Counselor, we have witness testimony that confirms their cohabitation, joint financial accounts, and public presentation as a married couple. Under Montana's common law marriage statutes, this establishes a legal union that gives Mr. Mullins not only paternal rights, but spousal rights as well." Marcus Reynolds rose from his chair with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd been practicing law longer than Caroline had been alive. "Your Honor, if I may address the court's time more efficiently, we have evidence that will render this entire proceeding moot." "Objection," Caroline said sharply. "Counsel is attempting to introduce evidence not disclosed during discovery." "Overruled," Judge Hartwell said dryly. "Mr. Reynolds, you have my attention. This had better be good." Marcus approached the bench with a manila envelope that seemed to carry the weight of revelation. "Your Honor, yesterday afternoon we received the results of a court-ordered paternity test. The results are illuminating." The courtroom fell silent except for the whisper of paper as Marcus withdrew a document that would change everything. Trevor's face went white, then red, as understanding began to dawn. Caroline's professional composure cracked slightly as she realized her case was about to collapse in the most public way possible. "The test confirms what Miss Harlow has maintained. From the beginning," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "Mr. Trevor Mullins is not the biological father of the child she's carrying." The announcement hit the gallery like a thunderclap. Voices rose in shock and confusion, while Judge Hartwell's gavel demanded order with sharp, authoritative strikes. Trevor lurched to his feet, his face twisted with disbelief and rage. "That's impossible," he shouted. "She was mine. Nobody else was—" "Mr. Mullins," Judge Hartwell's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "You will control yourself in my courtroom, or you will be removed." Caroline was on her feet as well, her mind racing through legal implications and professional embarrassment. "Your Honor, we request time to verify these results, and—" "The results were processed by the state laboratory using samples collected under court supervision," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "There's nothing to verify except the obvious conclusion that Mr. Mullins has no legal standing in this matter whatsoever." In the gallery, Lena felt the eyes of the entire town turning toward her, and she knew that questions she'd hoped to avoid forever were about to become public knowledge. The shame she'd carried for months, not just about being unmarried and pregnant, but about the true circumstances of her child's conception, was about to be laid bare before neighbors who'd known her since childhood. Miss Harlow, Judge Hartwell, said, her tone gentler but still carrying judicial authority, "I'm afraid the court will need clarification about the actual paternity of your child." Lena rose slowly, her hands trembling as she faced the packed courtroom. Among the crowd, she could see faces she recognized, former classmates, church members, people who'd watched her grow up and achieve things they'd expected great futures from. Now she had to tell them a truth that would shatter whatever remained of her reputation. "Your Honor," she said, her voice barely audible before growing stronger with each word. "The father of my child is Dr. Richard Morrison. He's married, with children of his own. The relationship was a mistake that I've regretted every day since." The second revelation hit even harder than the first. Caroline Morrison's face went ashen as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Dr. Richard Morrison, her uncle, her family's golden child, the respected physician who delivered half the babies in Copper Creek County over the past 15 years. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered in the gallery, and Judge Hartwell's gavel came down again, though with less force this time. Even she seemed stunned by the turn the proceedings had taken. Trevor's lawyer mode collapsed entirely, revealing the violent core that Lena knew too well. "You lying whore," he screamed, lunging toward her across the courtroom barrier. "You told me it was mine. You let me believe." He never finished the sentence. Weston was moving before Trevor cleared the rail, intercepting him with a tackle that sent both men crashing into the plaintiff's table. The courtroom erupted in chaos as bailiffs rushed to separate them, but not before Weston had pinned Trevor to the floor with the kind of controlled violence that spoke to years of handling. "Dangerous cattle and dangerous men." "Bailiff!" Judge Hartwell's voice cut through the melee with the authority of absolute power. "Remove Mr. Mullins from my courtroom, and if he sets foot in this county again without legal business, he'll be spending his next birthday in my jail." As Trevor was dragged away, still screaming accusations and threats, Caroline stood frozen at her table. The uncle she'd looked up to all her life, the man who'd paid for her law school education and given her away at her almost wedding to Weston, had destroyed a young woman's life and then hidden behind his reputation while she suffered the consequences alone. "Your Honor," Marcus said, straightening his tie and returning to business as if courtroom brawls were part of his regular Tuesday routine, "I move for immediate dismissal of all claims against my client and Miss Harlow." "Granted," Judge Hartwell said wearily. "Case dismissed. Miss Morrison, I suggest you have a conversation with your client about the difference between paternal rights and stalking statutes." But Caroline was already gathering her papers with hands that shook with more than professional embarrassment. As the courtroom began to empty, she approached Lena with the careful movements of someone walking through a minefield. "I didn't know," she said quietly, her professional composure completely abandoned. "About Richard, about what he did to you. I didn't know." Lena looked at the woman who'd been her adversary just moments before and saw something she recognized, the particular pain that came from discovering that people you trusted were capable of unthinkable betrayal. "I know you didn't," Lena said gently. "If you had, you wouldn't have taken Trevor's case. What will you do now? About Richard, I mean. About—" Caroline gestured helplessly at the wreckage of the morning's revelations. "Nothing," Lena said firmly. "I don't want his money, his acknowledgement, or his presence in my child's life. I just want to be left alone to raise my baby in peace, outside." The courthouse, Weston waited by his truck while the town of Copper Creek slowly absorbed the bombshell that had just exploded in their quiet community. The preacher's daughter hadn't just fallen from grace. She'd been pushed by one of their most respected citizens, then abandoned to face the consequences alone. As Lena emerged from the courthouse, she carried herself differently than she had that morning. The shame that had bowed her shoulders for months was still there, but it was accompanied by something new. Relief that the truth was finally known, and determination to build a future from the ruins of her past. "It's over," she said, as Weston helped her into the truck. "This part is," he agreed, "but you know this changes things. People will talk, some will judge, some will understand." Lena touched the silver locket at her throat, the one piece of jewelry she'd managed to keep through all her trials. Inside was a picture of her as valedictorian, smiling and hopeful and certain the world was full of possibilities. That girl was gone, but the woman who'd replaced her was stronger, wiser, and finally free from the secrets that had been slowly killing her. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "I'm tired of running from the truth. My baby deserves better than a mother who's ashamed of her own story." As they drove back toward the ranch, neither of them noticed the car following at a discreet distance, or the man behind the wheel, whose comfortable life was about to become very complicated indeed. Dr. Richard Morrison had heard about the paternity results through the medical community's efficient gossip network, and he was beginning to understand that some mistakes couldn't be buried forever, especially when they were about to be born and start asking questions about their father. The reckoning came 3 days after the courthouse revelation, in the Poisson form of a black Lincoln town car pulling up the gravel drive to the Cade Ranch at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. From the kitchen window, Martha watched a tall, distinguished man in an expensive overcoat step out and adjust his tie with the careful precision of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary task. "Weston," she called, her voice carrying the edge it took on when she sensed trouble approaching. "You need to see this." Dr. Richard Morrison looked every inch the successful physician as he walked toward the front porch, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of being Copper Creek's most respected citizen. But there was something different about him this morning, a tension in his shoulders that spoke to sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Weston met him at the porch steps, having emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on a mare expected to foal any day. There was hay dust on his shirt and honest work on his hands, a contrast that wasn't lost on either man as they faced each other across the divide of class and circumstance. "Dr. Morrison," Weston said, his voice carefully neutral, "didn't expect to see you here." Mr. Cade, Morrison's usually warm bedside manner, had been replaced by something cooler, more formal. "I think we both know why I'm here." From the guest wing window, Lena watched the confrontation unfold with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had dreaded it since the truth had been spoken in open court 3 days ago. Dr. Morrison had avoided her since that terrible night 9 months ago, when grief and loneliness had collided in his office after hours, resulting in a moment of weakness that had destroyed her life and was now threatening to destroy his. "I assume you want to discuss Lena," Weston said, settling into one of the porch rockers and gesturing for Morrison to take the other. It was a calculated move, forcing the conversation to take place in full view of anyone who might be watching, stripping away the privacy that allowed secrets to fester. Morrison remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Weston of his old military days, a man preparing to face a firing squad with whatever dignity he could muster. "I want to discuss the child, my responsibilities, the arrangements that need to be made." "What kind of arrangements?" "Financial, primarily. Medical care, education, whatever the child needs." Morrison's voice was steady, but his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd watched his life's work crumble in the space of a few days. "I also need to know what Miss Harlow intends to do about the situation." "You mean whether she's going to press charges for what you did to her?" The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. "It wasn't what happened between us wasn't." He struggled to find words that could reframe the events without outright lying. "She was grieving her mother's anniversary. She came to the office late, upset, and I made a mistake." A terrible mistake in judgment. Is that what you're calling it? Weston's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his grey eyes. A mistake in judgment? I never intended for any of this to happen. When she stopped coming to the office, stopped returning my calls, I thought she was handling things privately. I had no idea about the pregnancy until Morrison's composure cracked slightly, until I heard the courthouse testimony. The kitchen door opened, and Lena stepped onto the porch with the careful movements of a woman whose body was preparing for birth. She wore one of Martha's flower print dresses, altered to accommodate her swollen belly, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid that made her look younger than her 22 years. In her hand, she carried something that made Morrison's face go white, a small wooden cross, hand-carved and worn smooth by decades of handling. "Hello, Richard," she said quietly, using his first name with the familiarity that spoke to their shared history. "I wondered when you'd come." Morrison stared at the cross in her hands, recognition flooding his features. "That's your grandfather's. The one he carved during the war. He gave it to me before he died. Said it would help me remember that forgiveness was possible, even when it seemed impossible." Lena's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the wooden artifact. "I've been carrying it ever since that night in your office, trying to understand how something so wrong could come from two people who were supposed to be good. Lena, let me finish." Her voice carried a strength that hadn't been there 9 months ago, forged in the fires of public shame and private suffering. "What happened between us was wrong. You were my doctor, my counselor, someone I trusted. You took advantage of my grief and my loneliness, and then you let me face the consequences alone." Morrison's carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of truth spoken plainly. I was grieving too. My son's death, the divorce, everything falling apart. That's not an excuse, but it's the only explanation I have. "Your son?" Weston's voice sharpened with understanding. "The accident in Denver, that was your boy. Car crash 6 months before that night with Lena. Drunk driver, broad daylight, just like that he was gone." Morrison's voice broke. 25 years old, just finished medical school, his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't save him. Couldn't even be there when he died, because I was stuck in surgery with someone else's child. The confession hung in the air like grief made visible. Lena felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. She'd known Dr. Morrison her entire life, had watched him deliver dozens of babies and comfort countless families through loss. The man who'd taken advantage of her grief had been drowning in his own. "That doesn't excuse what you did," she said firmly, "but it helps me understand why you did it." "I ruined your life," Morrison said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his soul. "Everything you'd worked for, everything you'd achieved, gone because of one night of weakness and selfishness." "You didn't ruin my life," Lena said, one hand moving protectively over her belly. "You changed it, yes. Made it harder, more complicated, more painful than it should have been. But you didn't ruin it." Morrison looked at her with something approaching wonder. "How can you say that? Look what's happened to you. Your father disowning you, the town treating you like a pariah, living rough and alone until Weston found me," Lena finished. "Until I learned that kindness exists without conditions, that protection doesn't always come with a price, that good people still exist even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise." She turned to face Weston, and for the first time since he'd found her in that barn, he saw something new in her eyes. Not just gratitude or relief, but something deeper and more dangerous, something that looked suspiciously like love. "I need to tell you both something," she said, her voice taking on the kind of formal tone that preceded life-changing announcements. "I've been having contractions since yesterday, real ones this time, not the false alarms. The baby's coming, probably within the next day or two." The words galvanized both men into action. Morrison's medical training kicked in automatically. His personal crisis temporarily set aside in favor of professional responsibility. We need to get you to the hospital now. First babies can be unpredictable, and given your recent stress levels... No. Lena's voice was firm. I'm not going to the hospital. I'm staying here. Lena, that's not safe, Weston said, his protective instincts flaring. If something goes wrong, then Dr. Morrison can help. He's delivered more babies than anyone in the county, and this ranch has seen births before. Lena's grip tightened on the wooden cross. I'm not having my baby in a sterile hospital room surrounded by strangers. I'm having her here, where I'm safe, where I'm loved, where she'll be welcomed into a family that chose us both. Morrison struggled with competing impulses, his medical ethics demanding the safest possible environment for delivery, his personal guilt making him reluctant to insert himself further into Lena's life. The liability issues alone. I'll sign whatever papers you need, Lena said, but I'm not changing my mind. This baby was conceived in shame and fear, but she's going to be born in love and safety. Here, with the people who matter, as if summoned. By her words, Martha appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming cup of tea and wearing the expression of someone who'd been eavesdropping with professional efficiency. Dr. Morrison, she said briskly, if you're staying to help with the birth, you'll need to know that I've assisted with ranch deliveries before. Dr. Chen is on standby if we need backup, and the helicopters can have Lena in Billings in 30 minutes if complications arise. Morrison stared at the unlikely assembly, a wealthy rancher who'd taken in a stranger, an Irish housekeeper who spoke of helicopter evacuations like other women discussed dinner plans, and a young woman who'd survived the worst kind of betrayal and somehow found the strength to forgive. It was the kind of family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. All right, he said finally. If this is what you want, Lena, then I'll stay. But we do this by the book. Sterile conditions, emergency preparations, everything exactly as it would be in a hospital. As the three of them began planning for the birth that would change all their lives, none of them noticed the black SUV parked on the ridge overlooking the valley, or the telephoto lens trained on the ranch house below. Trevor Mullins might have been banished from the county, but he had friends who owed him favors, and revenge was a dish that could be served cold. The baby was coming, and with her, a reckoning that would test every bond that had been forged in the crucible of the past. Few weeks. But for now, in the growing warmth of a Montana morning, three wounded souls prepared to welcome new life into a world that had taught them all the hard truth about the price of second chances. The labor began in earnest just after midnight, with contractions that doubled Lena over and sent Weston scrambling for Dr. Morrison, who'd taken up residence in the main house's downstairs study. The ranch had been transformed into a makeshift birthing center, with Martha directing operations like a field general preparing for the most important battle of her life. How long between contractions? Morrison asked, pulling on surgical gloves. While Martha arranged sterilized towels and instruments with military precision, the guest wing bedroom had been converted into a delivery room, complete with emergency lighting and communication equipment that could summon a helicopter in minutes if needed. 4 minutes apart, Weston said, his voice tight with controlled anxiety. He'd helped deliver dozens of calves and foals over the years, but this was different. This was Lena, and the child she carried represented everything he'd come to care about in a world that had taught him to guard his heart carefully. Lena gripped the bedsheets as another contraction peaked, her breathing controlled despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. "It's happening fast," she gasped, "faster than I expected." Morrison checked her progress with the professional detachment he'd cultivated over 3 decades of practice, but his hands shook slightly as he worked. This wasn't just any patient. This was the woman whose life he'd destroyed, carrying the child he'd fathered in a moment of weakness that had cost them both everything. "You're doing beautifully," he said, and for a moment his voice carried the gentle authority that had comforted thousands of women through the miracle and terror of childbirth. "The baby's in perfect position. Everything looks textbook normal." Outside, the Montana night was alive with the kind of spring storm that brought both renewal and chaos to the high country. Lightning illuminated the valley in stark, momentary clarity, while thunder rolled across the landscape like the voice of God announcing momentous events. The ranch hands had gathered in the main house kitchen, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. While they waited for news that would change the family they'd all chosen to serve. "Martha," Lena called out during a brief respite between contractions. "The music box, Emma's music box. Can you bring it here?" Martha hurried to retrieve the delicate wooden treasure from the nightstand, its painted flowers worn soft by decades of gentle handling. When she wound the tiny key, Beautiful Dreamer began to play in the tinkling notes that only childhood memories could produce, filling the room with a melody that spoke to hope and innocence and the possibility of new beginnings. "Emma would have loved this," Weston said quietly, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "She always said music made everything better, even the hardest things." Another contraction seized Lena with intensity that made her cry out despite her determination to stay strong. This baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and all the preparation in the world couldn't have prepared her for the primal force of new life demanding entrance into the world. "I can see the head," Morrison announced, his voice thick with emotion that had nothing to do with medical protocol. "One more good push, Lena. That's all it's going to take." But as Lena bore down with everything she had left, the lights in the ranch house suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the emergency battery-powered lamps Martha had positioned around the room. Outside, the storm had intensified, and a lightning strike had taken out the main power line that served the valley. "Generator," Weston said, already moving toward the door. "I'll get the backup power running." "No time," Morrison said sharply. "The baby's crowning. We're doing this by lamplight, just like doctors did for 100 years before electricity." In the flickering glow of the emergency lamps, Lena gathered her strength for the final push that would bring her daughter into the world. The music box continued its gentle melody, a counterpoint to the storm raging outside and the intensity of birth happening within. Martha held her hand, while Weston positioned himself beside Morrison, ready to help however he could. "Now," Morrison said, his voice cutting through the storm and the pain and the fear. "Push now, Lena." She bore down with the last of her strength, feeling her body surrender to forces older than civilization, older than language, older than everything except the fundamental drive to create life from love. The pain crested and broke like a wave against the shore, and suddenly the room was filled with a sound that made every adult present catch their breath. A baby's cry. Strong, lusty, indignant at being forced from the warm safety of the womb into a world of light and air and possibility. "It's a girl," Morrison announced, his voice breaking with wonder and joy and the kind of awe that came from witnessing the miracle of birth, no matter how many times he'd seen it before. A beautiful, perfect little girl. He placed the baby on Lena's chest, and in that moment, everything else fell away. The storm, the complications, the painful history that had brought them all to this place. There was only a mother and her daughter, seeing each other for the first time in a world suddenly made new by the simple fact of their being together. "Hello, little one," Lena whispered, her voice filled with love so pure it made the adults around her remember what it felt like to believe in miracles. "I'm your mama, and I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby's cry had filled the room with more than sound. It had filled it with hope, with the promise that sometimes the most beautiful things could come from the most difficult circumstances. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, and the first faint traces of dawn were touching the eastern mountains with gold. The sunrise that followed the storm painted the valley in shades of gold and promise. but the peace of dawn was shattered by the sound of vehicles racing up the gravel drive. Weston, who'd been dozing in the chair beside Lena's bed while she nursed their daughter, was instantly alert at the sound of trouble approaching fast. Through the window, he could see Sheriff Hawkins' patrol car leading a convoy that included an ambulance, a social services van, and bringing up the rear like a predator following the herd, Trevor Mullins in a rental car with temporary plates. "Son of a bitch," Weston muttered, then caught himself and glanced apologetically at Lena. "Sorry, but it looks like we've got company." Lena tightened her arms protectively around the baby, who'd been born healthy and strong, despite all the complications that had preceded her arrival. They'd named her Grace, after Lena's mother, and she was everything a newborn should be, pink and perfect, and blissfully unaware that her first morning in the world was about to become a legal battlefield. Dr. Morrison, who'd stayed through the night to monitor both mother and child, appeared in the doorway with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this kind of confrontation before. "They can't take the baby," he said firmly. "Not without a court order, and even then not from a mother who's done nothing wrong." "Tell that to Trevor," Weston said, watching as the convoy parked and uniformed officials began emerging from their vehicles. "He's got friends in low places, and apparently some of them work for the county." Martha materialized with the speed of someone who'd been expecting this moment since the first contraction began. In her hands, she carried a leather portfolio that looked official enough to stop an army. "Birth certificate," she announced. "Filed electronically with the county clerk 30 minutes ago. Baby Grace Harlow Cade, born at 3:17 a.m. Parents listed as Lena Rae Harlow and Weston James Cade." Weston stared at her. "Harlow Cade. Seemed appropriate," Martha said with the satisfied smile of someone who'd outmaneuvered bureaucracy at its own game. "Seeing as how you're planning to marry the girl and adopt the baby properly. Least that's what any fool with eyes could see, if they bothered to look." Before Weston could process the implications of what Martha had done, Sheriff Hawkins was knocking on the front door with the reluctant authority of a man who'd been forced into a situation he didn't like but couldn't avoid. "Weston," Jake called through the door, "we need to talk. Got some folks here with papers, and they're insisting on seeing the baby." Weston kissed Lena's forehead gently. "Stay here. Keep Grace with you. This won't take long." He met the delegation on the front porch, where Trevor stood surrounded by a social worker with a clipboard, a family court official with an attitude, and enough legal paperwork to choke a horse. Trevor looked different than he had in the courthouse, cleaner, more presentable, like someone had coached him on how to appear sympathetic to bureaucrats. "Mr. Cade," the social worker began, consulting her clipboard with officious efficiency. "I'm Janet Mills from Child Protective Services. We've received allegations that a newborn infant is being kept in unsafe conditions by an unfit mother." "Unsafe conditions." Weston's voice was dangerously quiet. "The baby was delivered by a licensed physician in sterile conditions with emergency medical backup standing by. What exactly do you consider unsafe about that?" "Home births carry inherent risks," the court official interjected. "And given Miss Harlow's circumstances, there are questions about her fitness as a mother." "What circumstances would those be?" Dr. Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a scalpel as he stepped onto the porch. "The circumstances of being a college graduate with no criminal record who made the responsible choice to seek proper medical care and safe housing for her child." Trevor couldn't contain himself any longer. "She's a whore who doesn't even know who the father is. That baby could belong to anybody." The words hung in the air like a curse, but they'd been spoken to the wrong audience. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward with the kind of expression that had made grown men reconsider their life. "Choices for 20 years. Mr. Mullins," Jake said conversationally, "you're on private property making slanderous accusations about a woman who just gave birth. You've got 30 seconds to get back in that rental car and drive away before I arrest you for harassment and disturbing the peace. You can't do that. I got rights. I got papers." "What you've got," Martha said, appearing on the porch with a document that looked far more official than anything Trevor's lawyer had produced, "is exactly nothing. This is a marriage certificate filed this morning with the county clerk. Mr. and Mrs. Weston Cade, legally wed by the authority vested in retired Judge Samuel Brennan. That would be my late husband, for those keeping track." The announcement hit the assembled officials like a thunderbolt. Trevor's face went white, then red, then purple as the implications sank in. A married couple with a newborn baby, living on their own property with adequate resources and medical care, presented no legal grounds for intervention by any agency. "When?" Weston asked, staring at Martha with something approaching awe. 3 o'clock this morning," Martha said smugly. "Right after the baby was born. Lena signed the papers between contractions. You signed them while she was sleeping, and I witnessed the whole thing in my capacity as notary public. All perfectly legal and properly filed." From inside the house came the sound of a baby crying. Not the lusty protest of birth, but the simple demand of an infant who wanted her mother's attention. It was the most natural sound in the world, and it cut through all the legal posturing and bureaucratic maneuvering like truth through lies. "Gentlemen," Dr. Morrison said with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years protecting mothers and children, "you're disturbing a family's first day together. Unless you have a valid court order, which none of you seem to possess, I suggest you leave these people in peace." As the convoy of officials retreated down the drive, Trevor Mullins made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his plans. "This isn't over," he shouted from his rental car. "That baby's still got Morrison blood, and money talks louder than fake marriage certificates." But his words were lost in the morning wind, and by the time the dust settled, all that remained was a family, new, complicated, and legally binding in the eyes of God and the state of Montana. 6 months had transformed the Cade Ranch from a successful business operation into something approaching a small kingdom, with baby Grace reigning as its undisputed princess. The guest wing had been converted into a proper nursery and family quarters, complete with a rocking chair by the window, where Lena spent her mornings teaching her daughter about the valley that stretched beyond the glass, like a promise of endless possibilities. The morning ritual had become sacred in the Cade household. Weston would rise before dawn to check the cattle and review the day's work with Diego Santos, but he was always back by 7 o'clock to share breakfast with his wife and daughter. Wife. The word still surprised him sometimes, though 6 months of marriage had taught him that legal documents couldn't create love, only recognize what was already there. "She's got your stubborn streak," Lena observed, trying to coax Grace into taking her bottle, while the baby demonstrated a clear preference for exploring the fascinating textures of her mother's hair. "And your determination to do things your own way." Weston settled into the chair beside them, his coffee steaming in the morning air that carried the scent of hay and horses and the kind of contentment that money couldn't buy. "She's got your intelligence. Look at those eyes. She's already figuring out how to get what she wants." Grace, as if understanding she was the subject of discussion, favored them both with a toothless grin that made grown ranch hands melt into puddles of adoration. She'd become the unofficial mascot of the operation, with 67 employees competing to see who could make her laugh loudest during the rare occasions when she visited the barns with her parents. The sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive interrupted their morning peace, but this time the arrival brought joy rather than trouble. Reverend Samuel Harlow climbed out of his old pickup truck with the careful movements of a man who'd learned that pride came before falls, and that sometimes the longest journeys were the ones that brought you home. The reconciliation between father and daughter had been gradual, built on Sunday afternoon visits that grew longer and more comfortable as Grace grew older, and Samuel learned to see his grandson-in-law as a blessing rather than a complication. The rigid preacher who'd cast out his daughter in shame had been replaced by a grandfather who read Bible stories in a rocking chair and declared that God's grace was most evident in the laughter of children. "Morning, Papa," Lena called as her father approached the porch. The word still felt new on her tongue, but it carried healing for wounds that had seemed permanent just months before. "Morning, daughter." "Morning, Weston." Samuel accepted a cup of coffee from Martha, who'd appointed herself the family's unofficial diplomat in all matters requiring delicate negotiation. "How's my granddaughter this fine day?" Grace responded to her grandfather's voice with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for feeding time, reaching out with tiny hands that had already learned to recognize the people who loved her. Samuel took her with the careful reverence of someone who'd spent too many years believing he didn't deserve such gifts. "She's strong," he said, marveling at the baby's grip on his finger. "Takes after her mother that way, determined to make her mark on the world." From the kitchen came the sound of Martha humming Irish lullabies while she prepared what she called a proper breakfast for growing babies and growing families. The phrase had become her standard response to any situation requiring comfort food, maternal wisdom, or the kind of sustenance that fed both body and soul. Dr. Morrison's visits had become monthly affairs, professional checkups that served as excuses for personal absolution. He'd established a college fund for Grace that would ensure her education, regardless of whatever decisions her parents made about acknowledging his paternity. The money came with no strings attached and no expectations beyond the hope that someday his biological daughter might understand that good people were capable of terrible mistakes, and that redemption was possible even when forgiveness seemed impossible. "He's trying," Lena had told Weston after Morrison's last visit. "Trying to be better than he was, trying to make amends for what can't be undone. I think that's the best any of us can do." Caroline Morrison had returned to her practice in Billings, but not before making peace with the situation in her own way. She'd sent a silver rattle for Grace's christening, along with a note that simply said, "For new beginnings and the courage to embrace them." The gesture had cost her nothing financially, but everything emotionally, representing a woman's choice to honor the innocent child despite the complicated circumstances of her conception. Trevor Mullins had vanished from their lives as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving only the occasional rumor that he'd found work in the oil fields of North Dakota, where questions about a man's past were discouraged by company policy and enforced by fellow workers who valued privacy above all else. As the morning sun climbed higher over the valley, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green that spoke to the eternal promise of renewal, Weston found himself thinking about legacy and the strange ways life rearranged itself around love. The ranch would continue to prosper under his management, but it would be Grace who inherited not just the land, but the stories that gave it meaning. She would grow up knowing that her mother had been brave enough to choose love over security, that her adoptive father had been strong enough to protect strangers who became family, and that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the worst disasters. In the main house, Martha had positioned a new addition to the mantelpiece, a professional family portrait taken by the photographer from Billings, who specialized in ranch families and understood how to capture the kind of happiness that came from weathering storms together. Weston in his best suit, Lena in a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Grace in the white christening gown that had belonged to Emma Cade before tragedy had claimed her. But it was the silver locket around Lena's neck that completed the portrait's story. Inside, the photograph of her as valedictorian had been joined by a picture of Grace on her christening day, past and future united in a circle of precious metal that had survived everything life could throw at one family's dreams. "What are you thinking about?" Lena asked, settling beside him on the porch swing while Grace napped in her grandfather's arms. "Just thinking about how sometimes the worst days of your life turn out to be the beginning of the best days," Weston said, pulling his wife closer and marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. How sometimes, when you think you're saving someone, they end up saving you instead. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endless and blue above the valley where 3 generations of Cades had built their dreams on 40,000 acres of hope and hard work. Inside the house, a baby slept in her grandfather's arms, while her grandmother hummed Irish lullabies and planned Sunday dinners that would last for decades to come. And on the porch, where it all began, a man and woman who'd found each other in the aftermath of storms watched their daughter discover the world one giggle at a time, secure in the knowledge that some stories really do have happy endings, especially the ones that begin with someone brave enough to say, "Get up, girl. You're mine now."